Okay, now we're gonna head through some topics. Um, we covered what I felt were kind of the easiest examples of reducing trigonometric identities, and we're gonna look at a few that, I'll be honest, you might not get them. Okay, some of you probably pick them up, some of you might not, and you just gotta do your best to pick up the ones you can. You can't get every problem, you can't worry about it. So we'll do our best. So here we have something interesting. It says tangent square root of theta over secant minus 1. Now, a lot of people might look at this secant minus 1. If you look at your sheet from yesterday, you might say, well, secant squared minus 1 is equal to what? Okay, so secant squared of theta minus 1 is equal to tangent squared. But I want to be clear. Secant of theta minus 1 is different than that. And it is not equal to tangent of theta. Okay, you can't do that. So what I want to do is I want to look at my sheet and see if I can find a secant of theta minus 1. As I look at my sheet, I see okay, I see this one right here. See secant minus 1? It's multiplied by secant plus 1. That comes from secant squared minus 1. This is the difference of two squares. Remember x squared minus 9 factors? X plus 3 and x minus 3, right? Well, secant squared minus 1 factors is secant minus 1 and secant plus 1. So you can see that secant squared minus 1 is equal to that. That's where you get secant minus 1. Secant squared minus 1 is equal to tangent squared. So that will give me a little bit of hint in terms of how I'm going to set up this problem. Instead of looking at the bottom in this situation, reducing secant of theta minus 1, I'm going to change the top. I'm going to make the top secant squared of theta minus 1 over the bottom secant of theta minus 1. See how I change that? Now I'm going to factor. According to that sheet that we just looked at, you can see that it says secant squared minus 1 is secant minus 1 times secant plus 1. So I'll write secant of theta minus 1 times secant of theta plus 1 all over secant of theta minus 1. Secant squared minus 1 according to this formula right here. This formula right here, number 6, says 1 plus tangent squared is secant squared. Therefore, tangent squared is equal to secant squared minus 1. A, there's a square. That's your first indication. But B, it's like asking how do you know if 57 is a prime number? 57 is not a prime number. Factors to 3 and 19. Not many people know that. You gotta just get good at it. And hopefully after you see a lot of examples, you know. But unfortunately, most of the time I can tell you what step to take every time. You can really do that here. Just gotta see enough examples and hopefully get good at them. Okay, what cancels? Yeah. Now I can cross those off and left with this. So you can play the plus one. Similar for the next one. You're used to seeing a cosine squared. Well, I don't have a cosine squared. But I can change sine squared to what? Sine squared is the same as 1 minus cosine squared. Right? Does that factor? It's the difference of two squares, so it factors. 1 minus the cosine of theta, and is cosine of theta plus 1 and 1 plus cosine of theta, are those the same things? Is cosine of theta plus 1 and 1 plus the cosine of theta, are those the same? Yes, they are. So I can cancel those off. And we're just left with 1 over 1 minus the cosine of theta. Sometimes you might look at a problem and you might say, boy, I wish there was a squared. Notice that when there's squareds, there's a lot of things that we can do, right? Well, here I don't have a squared. But if I multiply the secant through, will I come up with a squared? Yeah, so let's distribute that through. I'm going to show you a little bit of a shortcut. What's secant times secant? A lot of times you've been writing secant times cosine, you've been writing out, reducing it, but I want you to just think about it real quick. What's the relationship between secant and cosine? What are they compared to each other? They are not opposites. Opposite would be like 3 and negative 3. They're reciprocals. What happens when you multiply two reciprocals? You always get 1. Are secant and cosine reciprocals? So that way I don't have to actually show that step, like 1 over cosine times cosine. Might save me a little bit of work. Okay. Is secant squared minus 1 something special? What is it? Tangent squared. That would be number 6 on your formula sheet. No. I will give you 3 main topics that you need to know for your final exam. You'll include this. You'll include solving trigonometric equations, which we're getting to on Monday. We'll also include solving triangles. Really those 3 items. I might have graphing, sine, and cosine on that. But it will be, I will narrow it to like 3 main topics that you have to know. Okay. This one, I'm going to distribute sine through. What's sine times sine? And then I have a sine times a cosecant. What's the relationship between sine and cosecant? They're reciprocals. So when I multiply them, I'll get 1 cosine squared of theta. See that the sine times the cosecant becomes the 1 in front of the cosine squared. Is sine squared plus cosine squared something special? One. That's one that catches people every single year. People are like, where is it? And they look and they look and they look. That's the most important identity in the sheet. Flip it over. Like for that one? That one is number 5. So we're looking at number 5. What does number 5 say? There you go. All right. Here I don't have any squares. So let's multiply it out or FOIL it out. What's 1 times 1? What is 1 times positive cosine? Cosine. What's negative cosine times 1? And what's negative cosine times positive cosine? Negative cosine squared. Good. What happens in this situation? I get 1 minus cosine squared theta. What is 1 minus cosine squared? Sine squared. What's tangent times tangent? Tangent squared. What's tangent times negative secant? Negative secant theta tangent. Secant times tan is positive secant theta times tangent. And secant times negative secant is negative secant squared. What do you notice? I get tangent squared of theta minus secant squared of That's number 6, right? 1 plus tangent squared is secant squared. So if we were to subtract the secant squared over, we get 1 plus tangent squared minus secant squared is equal to 0. And if I subtract the 1, I get tangent squared minus secant squared is negative 1. I think what I have written down on the sheet says something slightly different. It says secant squared minus tangent squared is positive 1. If we switch it, it is negative 1. Tricky. Oh, Mr. Jerk. Don't call me a jerk, Raquel. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. I'm talking to YouTube Nation, not to myself. Natalie. Yeah. You guys are done with you. All right. Let's try. We're not going to do all these. We'll try H. H is a little bit tricky. Do you see any squares? I don't either. I don't see any way to come up with a square. Actually, nope. I do see a way to come up with a square, though. If I write it like this, cosine of theta over 1 times sine of theta over cosine of theta plus cosine of theta over sine of theta times cosine of theta. I just wrote everything in terms of cosine and sine. Went back to where we started. In the first term, what do you notice cancels? And I'm left with sine of theta. I'm going to write it over 1, because I know I can get a fraction over there. What do I get in the numerator of the next part? Didn't seem like we were going to come up with a squared, but we did. We came up with a cosine squared, didn't we? That's kind of helpful. If I have a cosine squared, what else would be helpful to get? What goes with the cosine squared? Sine squared. Well, if I made these like fractions, fractions I could add together, they would have to have common denominators, right? What's the common denominator between sine and 1? Sine. So I have to multiply top and bottom by sine. What will you now get in the numerator? Sine squared. What's my new denominator? Sine. What is sine squared plus cosine squared? 1. Is 1 over sine something special? J, do you see a square? Where? Yep, there's a sine squared. Very good. 1 minus cosine of theta over 1 times sine of theta over 1 times sine of theta over cosine of theta. What cancels? What squared do you get? Is 1 minus sine squared something special? Okay, let's look at K. Not always hungry. What would you like? Cookie? Pizza. Stroganoff. I like stroganoff. Beef stroganoff? Me too. Good. Alright. Should have a potluck in here? I think the school board would love that. So what'd you do in trigonometry class? We made potluck. Oh, did you learn math? Yeah, sure. We counted the number of noodles we ate. Okay. Alright. This one has plenty of squares. I'm going back to something that we did yesterday. Remember what you should do in this type of technique? Factor. Take out a cosine squared. What are you left with if you take out a cosine squared? 1 minus, or 1 plus, cotangent squared. Is 1 plus cotangent squared something special? I think it's secant squared. I think it's cosecant squared. Are those reciprocals of each other? No, they're not. They have to be cosine squared times secant squared. So let's change these in terms of sine and cosine. See if something special happens. Cosecant squared is 1 over sine squared. So I get cosine squared over sine squared. What is cosine squared over sine squared? Cotangent squared. Let's try one. Instincts. What do you think we should do? Distribute? Okay. It is already factored, so we'll distribute. What's the relationship between cosecant and sine? Starts with an R. Multiply two reciprocals, you get what's 1 minus cosine squared? Cosecant times 1, or cosecant times sine is 1, and cosecant times sine is 1. So 1 cosine squared. Alright, let's get your assignment. I know you just want work done.